One of the strangest feelings a person can have is realizing that nothing is obviously wrong. You wake up, you go where you're supposed to go, you do what you're supposed to do. The bills get paid, the messages get answered, the week moves forward exactly as expected. From the outside, life appears to be working. And maybe it is. That's what makes the feeling so difficult to explain. If something were broken, at least there would be a reason, a crisis, a loss, a visible problem, something you could point to and say, there, that's why I feel this way. But sometimes the feeling arrives on completely ordinary days. You're driving home, you're sitting at dinner, you're folding laundry, you're standing in a grocery store, deciding between two things that don't really matter. And for a brief moment, a strange thought appears. Is this it? Not in a dramatic way, not as a complaint, more like a quiet confusion. A feeling that life somehow looks more complete than it feels. Most people don't talk about this, partly because it sounds ungrateful. After all, many of the things they once wanted are finally here. The stable job, the apartment, the relationship, the routine, the independence, the small comforts that used to exist somewhere in the future. And yet, there are moments when they sit inside the life they work so hard to build and feel unexpectedly distant from it. Not miserable, not hopeless, just distant. As if they're watching their own life through a window instead of fully living inside it. I think that's what makes this feeling so lonely. When people are suffering, they usually know they're suffering. When people are grieving, they usually know what they've lost. But what do you call the feeling that appears when life is functioning normally and something still feels absent? What do you call a kind of emptiness that exists without an obvious cause? I'm not sure. Maybe that's why so many people keep moving. The feeling is difficult to name, difficult to explain, and much easier to ignore. So the next day arrives, and then the next. Responsibilities continue. Goals continue. Life continues. Yet every now and then, usually when nobody else is around, the question quietly returns. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to be noticed. Why does everything seem fine, and yet something still feels missing? The difficult thing about this feeling is that it rarely arrives alone. It usually brings guilt with it, not overwhelming guilt, just enough to make you question yourself. Because once you notice the emptiness, another thought often follows. A thought many people would never say out loud. Why do I feel this way when I have so much to be grateful for? It's a reasonable question. Maybe that's why so many people immediately try to argue with the feeling instead of listening to it. They remind themselves of everything that's going well, the people who care about them, the opportunities they have, the problems they don't have, the things they once wished for. And all of that is real. The problem is that gratitude and fulfillment are not the same experience. A person can recognize the value of their life and still feel disconnected from it. A person can appreciate what they have and still sense that something important is missing. The two realities can exist at the same time. Yet many people spend years believing they must choose one or the other. Either they're grateful or they're empty. Either they're fortunate or they're struggling. So when both experiences appear together, confusion begins. The feeling becomes difficult to trust. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm expecting too much. Maybe everybody feels this way. Maybe this is simply adulthood. Maybe this is what life becomes. The mind searches for explanations because explanations feel safer than uncertainty. But explanations don't always make the feeling disappear. It often returns in ordinary moments. A Sunday afternoon, the end of a workday, the drive home after accomplishing something you spent months pursuing, moments that were supposed to feel satisfying, moments that do feel satisfying for a little while. Then something strange happens. The feeling fades faster than expected. The achievement remains. The emotion leaves. And people rarely talk about that part. How quickly certain victories become normal. How fast the future becomes the present. How easily the thing you once dreamed about becomes another ordinary piece of life. A promotion becomes your job. A new apartment becomes your apartment. A milestone becomes a memory. And before long, the mind begins looking ahead again, toward the next thing, the next improvement, the next goal, the next version of life that finally seems capable of delivering whatever still feels absent. I don't think most people consciously choose this pattern. In fact, many don't even notice it happening. They're simply moving forward, doing what responsible adults are supposed to do. Building careers, building relationships, building stability, building lives. And from the outside, it often looks successful. Yet somewhere underneath all that movement, a quieter question continues waiting. Not because life is bad, not because success is meaningless, not because gratitude is impossible, but because the feeling remains. The feeling that no matter how many pieces fall into place, something inside never quite settles. I sometimes think that's why this kind of emptiness feels so isolating. There's no obvious wound, no visible damage, nothing dramatic enough to justify the feeling. So people carry it privately. They smile, they work, they make plans, they continue moving forward, and occasionally, usually during a moment nobody else sees, they wonder whether the thing they're looking for is actually located where they've been searching. Not with despair, not even with sadness, just with a quiet uncertainty. The kind that appears when you've spent years building a life and still aren't completely sure by what it means to feel at home inside it. Maybe the feeling isn't coming from what your life lacks. Maybe it's coming from what your life has quietly become. I know that sounds like the beginning of some dramatic revelation. It isn't. Most of the changes that shape a person's life happen so gradually, they barely feel like changes at all. You finish school, you start working, you take on responsibilities, you make plans, you solve problems, you adapt. Then you adapt again. And after enough years, you become someone who is remarkably capable of managing obligations, capable of meeting expectations, capable of moving forward even when you're tired. For many people, that capability becomes a source of pride, and it should. Life asks a lot from people. There is something admirable about continuing anyway. But every now and then, a strange question appears. When was the last time I actually experienced my life while it was happening? Not managed it, not organized it, not improved it, experienced it. The distinction sounds small, yet I think it matters more than we realize, because it's possible to become highly skilled at building a life and much less skilled at inhabiting one. You can spend years creating stability, years creating security, years creating a future, then wake up one day and realize you've been living slightly ahead of your own experience for a very long time. Just a little further down the road, just beyond the present moment, after this project, after this deadline, after this promotion, after this move, after this problem gets solved, then things will calm down, then life will begin. Then I'll have time. Then I'll feel different. The difficult thing is that sometimes those moments arrive. The promotion happens. The move happens. The goal is achieved. The problem is solved, and for a while, it feels exactly as satisfying as you imagined. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the mind begins creating another horizon, another destination, another version of the future where everything finally comes together. Not because people are greedy, not because they're never satisfied, because many of us quietly learn to experience life as a sequence of arrivals, one destination after another, one milestone after another, one future replacing another. I don't think anyone teaches this directly. It simply becomes the air we're breathing, the assumption that meaning is always waiting somewhere ahead, the assumption that fulfillment is something we eventually reach, the assumption that if we keep moving, eventually the feeling will arrive. And maybe that's why the emptiness can feel so confusing, because it often appears in people who are doing exactly what they were told would make them fulfilled. They're responsible, they're productive, they're committed, and they're trying. Yet something inside remains untouched by all the progress. Not because progress is meaningless, because progress and meaning are not always the same thing. A person can move forward while feeling disconnected. A person can achieve goals while feeling emotionally absent from the experience. A person can spend years building a life that looks complete from the outside and still wonder why it doesn't fully feel like theirs. Maybe that's an uncomfortable thought. It is for me, because it suggests that some of the things we've been chasing may have been carrying expectations they could never realistically fulfill. A promotion can change your career. It cannot tell you who you are. A relationship can offer love. It cannot create a sense of self on your behalf. Financial security can remove certain fears. It cannot automatically create meaning. These things matter. They matter deeply. But perhaps we've occasionally asked them to solve a problem they were never designed to solve. And perhaps that's why the feeling persists. Not because your life is empty, but because some part of you has been waiting for something that achievement alone could never provide. Maybe that's why the feeling is so difficult to satisfy. because what it's asking for isn't always more. Sometimes it's asking for something entirely different. When people talk about emptiness, they often imagine the absence of something, the absence of success, the absence of love, the absence of purpose. But that hasn't always matched what I've observed. Some of the emptiest people I've met were surrounded by things they once desperately wanted. Not because those things were meaningless, because obtaining them and experiencing them turned out to be very different experiences. You can spend years working towards something, thinking about it, planning for it, sacrificing for it, then finally arrive and discover that the achievement itself only occupies a surprisingly small part of your life. The rest is just ordinary Tuesday mornings, ordinary dinners, ordinary conversations, ordinary evenings. Life returns to normal much faster than we expect. And perhaps that's where something important gets lost. Because many of us become so focused on reaching moments that we stop fully participating in the ones between them. The promotion matters. The wedding matters. The move matters. The accomplishment matters. But life cannot be made entirely of milestones. Most of existence happens in the spaces surrounding them. And yet those are often the exact moments we learn to overlook. I sometimes wonder how many people are waiting for a feeling that can only appear in the present while organizing their lives around the future. Not consciously, just habitually. A few years become 5, 5 become 10, and eventually the habit becomes invisible. You wake up, handle responsibilities, cross things off lists, move toward the next objective, then repeat. The strange thing is that a person can become extremely effective at this, highly productive, highly reliable, highly successful, and still carry a quiet sense that something essential is slipping through their hands. Not because they're failing, because they rarely stop long enough to notice what they're succeeding for. Maybe that's what people mean when they talk about feeling disconnected. Not disconnected from other people, disconnected from their own experience, from curiosity, from spontaneity, from the simple feeling of being interested in their own life. I don't mean excitement. Excitement comes and goes. I mean aliveness. That subtle feeling of actually being here. Not mentally living in next month, not emotionally living in some future version of yourself. Here, in this conversation, in this room, in this season of your life, I think children understand this naturally. Not because they're wiser, because they haven't yet learned to treat every moment as preparation for another moment. Somewhere along the way, many adults become experts at preparation. Preparation for success. Preparation for security. Preparation for the future. And sometimes preparation quietly replaces participation. You keep getting ready for life while life continues happening. Then one day you notice an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the emptiness isn't asking for another achievement. Maybe it isn't asking for another purchase, another accomplishment, another version of yourself. Maybe it's asking for your attention. Not attention directed toward the future, toward this life, the one already happening. the one you've spent years building, the one that often passes by while you're busy thinking about what comes next. I don't know. But sometimes I think the feeling people call emptiness isn't always an absence. Sometimes it's distance. The distance between the life you're living and the life you're actually experiencing. And perhaps that distance grows so slowly that most people don't notice it until one ordinary day when everything seems fine. And yet something inside quietly whispers that it no longer feels close. I sometimes think people notice the loss before they understand what was lost. Not all at once, in small flashes. A moment during a conversation, a quiet afternoon. A memory that appears unexpectedly and seems brighter than it should. And for a second, something feels different, closer, more real. Then it's gone again. Most people assume they're looking for happiness. I'm not sure that's always true, because some of the moments that stay with us aren't particularly happy. They're simply alive. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A night when nobody checked the time. A walk that had no destination. An afternoon spent completely absorbed in something for no practical reason. A moment of curiosity. A moment of wonder. A moment when you forgot to evaluate your life because you were too busy experiencing it. Those moments are strangely difficult to measure. You can't put them on a resume. You can't track them on a calendar. You can't easily explain why they mattered. Yet years later, they often remain more vivid than many of the achievements that once felt incredibly important. I find that interesting. The mind forgets countless productive days, but it remembers certain moments of presence with remarkable clarity. The smell of rain before a storm. A friend laughing so hard they couldn't finish a sentence. A summer evening that seemed to last forever. A song playing somewhere in the background while nothing important was happening. Ordinary moments. Yet somehow they continue living inside us. Maybe because those were the moments when we weren't trying to become anything. We were simply there, fully there. And perhaps that experience becomes rarer than we realize. Not because life becomes worse, because life becomes organized, structured, scheduled, efficient. Responsibilities accumulate, commitments multiply, days develop a rhythm. Wake up, respond, handle what needs handling, prepare for tomorrow, then repeat again and again. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. In many ways, it is what adulthood requires. The problem is that a person can become so focused on managing life that they gradually lose contact with the feeling of participating in it. The difference is subtle, but I think most people recognize it immediately when they encounter it. You see it sometimes when someone becomes unexpectedly excited about something, not because it's important, because they're interested, genuinely interested. Their attention wakes up. Their curiosity returns. For a few moments, they stop moving through life mechanically. Something feels alive again. And maybe that's what makes the feeling of emptiness so confusing. Because what people often miss isn't excitement. It isn't pleasure. It isn't constant happiness. It's contact. contact with their own experience, contact with the present moment, contact with the strange reality of being alive at all. I know that sounds abstract, but the experience itself usually isn't. It's incredibly ordinary. Looking out a train window and actually noticing the landscape, getting lost in a conversation, cooking a meal without rushing through it, laughing before you remember all the things you're supposed to be worried about. Tiny moments. Most of them would appear insignificant from the outside, yet they often leave behind a feeling that many accomplishments never do. A feeling that for a brief period of time, you weren't living somewhere ahead of your life. You were inside it. And perhaps that's why certain memories remain so warm. Not because they were perfect, because during those moments, there was no distance between you and your experience. You weren't preparing for the next chapter. You weren't trying to improve yourself. You weren't chasing anything. For a little while, you were simply participating. And maybe what feels missing now isn't another achievement waiting somewhere in the future. Maybe it's the feeling that occasionally appears when life stops being something you're managing and becomes something you're actually living. Maybe this is the part that many people spend years trying to outrun. Not because it's painful, because it's quiet. There are certain questions that rarely appear when life is moving quickly. They wait for slower moments. A long drive, a quiet evening, the few minutes before sleep arrives. And when they do appear, they often sound surprisingly simple. Am I actually living the life I'm working so hard to maintain? Do I still feel connected to the person who wanted these things in the first place? When was the last time I felt genuinely present? Not productive, not entertained, not distracted, present. The strange thing is that most people don't answer these questions. Not directly. Life is busy. There are responsibilities. People depend on us. There's always something that needs attention. So the questions remain unanswered, not rejected, just postponed. Months become years. Years become routines. And eventually, a person can become incredibly familiar with their schedule while feeling oddly unfamiliar with themselves. I think that's a lonelier experience than many people realize. Not loneliness because nobody is around. Loneliness because you slowly lose contact with your own experience. You know what needs to be done? You know where you're going? You know what tomorrow looks like? Yet something inside feels increasingly difficult to reach. Not lost, just distant. Like a friend you haven't spoken to in a long time. You know they're still there. You simply haven't spent much time together. And perhaps that distance explains something important. Maybe the feeling we call emptiness isn't always the absence of meaning. Maybe it's the absence of relationship, the relationship with your own life, the relationship with your own experience, the relationship with the person underneath all the roles you've learned to perform. Because most adults carry many identities: employee, partner, parent, friend, provider, responsible person, reliable person, capable person. These roles matter. They matter deeply. But after a while, It becomes possible to spend so much energy maintaining the roles that you stop checking on the person carrying them. And that person doesn't usually complain, at least not loudly. The signal is often much quieter. A lack of enthusiasm, a persistent distance, a feeling that life is happening, but not quite reaching you. And maybe that's why achievements alone struggle to solve the problem. Achievements can improve circumstances. They cannot create a relationship. Only attention can do that. Only presence can do that. Only the willingness to occasionally stop and ask, how am I? Really? Not how am I performing? Not how am I progressing? Not how am I compared to other people? Just, how am I? It's such a simple question. Yet many people go years without asking it honestly. Or perhaps they ask it and move on too quickly to hear the answer. I don't know. But sometimes I wonder whether the emptiness appears for the same reason thirst appears. Not to punish us, not to tell us we've failed, simply to tell us that something essential has gone unattended for too long. Not success, not productivity, not achievement, something quieter, something easier to overlook. The experience of being connected to your own life while you're living it. And perhaps that's why the feeling never fully disappears when we try to solve it from the outside, because it isn't standing outside waiting for us. It's waiting here, in the ordinary moments, in the present moment, in the parts of life we've been walking past while searching for something more, patiently, quietly, waiting. For us to notice that it never actually left. Maybe this is where people expect a final answer. A sentence that makes everything click. A conclusion that neatly explains the feeling. And I wish I had one, but the older I get, the more I suspect that some questions become less important once we stop fighting them. This might be one of them, because perhaps the goal was never to eliminate the emptiness completely. Perhaps the goal was to understand what it has been trying to tell us. For most of this video, we've talked about a feeling that seems difficult to explain. A life that looks fine, responsibilities being handled, goals being pursued, days moving forward exactly as they should. Yet somewhere underneath it all, a quiet sense that something important isn't being fully experienced. For a long time, many people assume that feeling means something is wrong, that they've chosen the wrong path, the wrong job, the wrong city, the wrong relationship. Sometimes that may be true, but often the feeling seems to appear in places where nothing is obviously broken. Which makes me wonder whether emptiness is sometimes misunderstood. Maybe it isn't a verdict. Maybe it isn't proof that your life lacks value. Maybe it isn't evidence that you've failed to find whatever everyone else seems to have found. Maybe it's something simpler, a reminder. A reminder that human beings need more than progress, more than stability, more than accomplishment. We need contact with our own experience, contact with the present, contact with the parts of ourselves that don't exist to achieve anything. And perhaps that's why some of the most meaningful moments in life often appear unexpectedly. Not while reaching a goal, but while forgetting about goals for a little while. the conversation that lasts longer than planned, an evening that feels strangely peaceful, a moment of curiosity, a moment of connection, a moment when you stop evaluating your life and simply participate in it. Most of those moments are small, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss, yet they often leave a deeper impression than many of the milestones we spend years pursuing. Maybe because they remind us of something we knew once and gradually forgot. That life is not only something we build, it is also something we experience, and when one side grows while the other quietly disappears, a certain kind of emptiness begins to emerge. Not as punishment, not as failure, as a signal. A gentle signal that some part of us wants to come back into the conversation. Not the ambitious part, not the productive part, not the part that is always preparing for tomorrow. The human part, the part that wants to feel present inside its own life. I don't know if that feeling ever disappears completely. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe every now and then it returns to remind us that there is a difference between moving through life and actually meeting it. And perhaps that's enough for tonight. Not an answer, not a solution, just a possibility that the thing you've been calling emptiness may not be an empty space at all. It may be an invitation, a quiet invitation to come a little closer to the life that is already here, the one happening beneath the plans, beneath the goals, beneath all the things you're trying to become, the one that has been waiting patiently this entire time, and maybe nothing needs to change immediately. Maybe there is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Maybe for a few moments, it is enough to simply notice that you are here and that your life is here too, still unfolding, still unfinished, still waiting to be lived.